strikes. As you and I were talking before we came on air here, the Ukraine side actually tried to derail the May 9th parade by shooting over about a 3-day period. I think 524, if I'm not mistaken, was the number that was being spun around. Various different types of drones, FPV drones, long-range drones, and then also apparently some HIMARS missiles were included in that as well, all of which were shot down, some of them on the outskirts of Moscow by K-52 helicopters, by the way. So that seemed to be a pretty good air defense system that the Russians have for that. But when the other missiles are and the aircraft and the drones are going the other direction, not quite so successful. What do you make of this back and forth?
Well, you know, I was watching, by the way, Rick Sanchez was in Moscow to interview people and talked about some of this earlier this morning. It's depressing, if for no other reason, because the use of the HIMARS missile tends to validate everyone's worst impressions of President Trump and his team. There doesn't seem to be any understanding in the Trump White House of the seriousness of this war and the importance of ending it, but more important, of recognizing something that President Trump previously did, which was the legitimacy of Russia's position on the war. So what we've now done is effectively said, well, I guess we didn't mean anything we said. President Trump said that Russia had a valid reason to go to war, that Ukraine would have to give up territory, and there was no way around that. And all of a sudden now he's gone back to repeating the nonsense that comes out of the CIA and the MI6 narratives that are spread across Western Europe. You know, Russia is bad, Russia is evil, and Russia must be defeated, which has no chance of happening. And Ukraine must stand fast on its demands. This is a catastrophe for the West. It's a catastrophe for the United States. Any opportunity, any chance whatsoever that we had to normalize relations with Russia are gone. These things are over. We now are seen as unambiguously as a co-belligerent. And anything that President Trump tries to undertake with Russia will be seen as completely unbelievable. There will be no credibility attached to anything that he says or does.
Well, as it turns out, there's also some confusing things from President Trump. And let's get kind of a running start into where we are today, because this is the day that Ukraine and the Western European countries came out, I think it was on Saturday, and demanded an unconditional 30-day ceasefire from the Russian side, effective as of midnight tonight, they said, or there will be hell to pay, there will be sanctions, and a bunch of other stuff. In response to that, Putin came out and said, okay, how about this? Instead of a 30-day ceasefire on Monday, what about we meeting in Istanbul on Thursday?
We propose to the Kyiv authorities to resume the talks they stopped and terminated in April 2022. I'm referring to direct talks without any preconditions, and we propose to start immediately on next Thursday, on the 15th of May in Istanbul.
And now here's an interesting thing, because when the European leaders, and it was Merz of Germany, Macron, Starmer, and Tusk of Poland, they went with and met in Kiev with Zelensky, and there was this really famous, just really kind of cheesy picture of the five of them walking down the street like they're some rock band or something like that, and all smiling like they're I don't know, they look more like a boy band than anything else, but they're all really confident. Well, they said at that time that they had gotten on a phone call with Trump, who agreed with them to demand a 30-day ceasefire, unconditional, from the Russian side. So that's what Trump was allegedly agreed to. At least that's what they said publicly, which I never saw it refuted by the American press. But first of all, let's kind of just take that one piece right there. What did you make of Trump, at least of them claiming that Trump said, yeah, we're with you on this demand for a 30-day ceasefire?
Well, it's a serious mistake. It destroys his opportunity to credibly talk with President Putin. He's essentially joined with the very people who are aligned with the Biden administration, and they are now desperate to keep the war going. everyone that you mentioned, from Tusk to Starmer, these are globalists. These are the people that opened Europe's borders to invasion, that invited millions of people from the Middle East and Africa, North Africa specifically, to march into their countries. You know, more recently, Starmer has said anyone who wants to come to Great Britain from India can live here for 3 years without paying any taxes. I mean, these people are absolutely determined to destroy the character, culture, and national identity of the countries that they rule. They are the enemies of their own people. And what we need to understand and refuse to accept is that these people are all going to be gone. Some will be gone shortly. Others, it may take another 6 months or a year. But none of these people represent the interests of the people they govern. They don't. And here is President Trump, who should understand that very clearly, that these people are his enemies. It is President Trump that wants to guard the borders. It's President Trump that wants to deport the illegal aliens. It's President Trump that wants to preserve American national identity. Well, he has those desires in common with President Putin. President Putin has the same platform. President Putin believes in religion as a key component of the nation's moral compass. This is something that President Trump should understand. I think he's very confused, or he simply doesn't know. He should have never, ever aligned himself with these individuals. They are as much his enemy as they are the enemies of Russia. So at this stage of the game, this is pure folly. These people have no capability whatsoever to influence anything. Now, if you got them all together and said, we're going to gather all of our forces in eastern Poland, use it as a staging base, and the eastern edge of Germany for a grand invasion of Ukraine, they would all be massacred. They would be utterly destroyed, just as the Ukrainian army has been destroyed. They are not organized, trained, or equipped for the kind of war that has been fought in eastern Ukraine. So this is sheer unadulterated nonsense. But the worst part is, as we pointed out earlier, we've continued to supply these Ukrainians with our weapons. Now, what difference does it make? Well, it should make a great deal of difference to us, because there's no reason for hostility with Russia. Russia is not our enemy. It hasn't been our enemy since the early 90s, assuming it was then. This is a different world. But again, these people are clinging to the world that's dying. This is the world that the globalists wanted to create, where national identity is meaningless, where everyone is sort of reduced to an amorphous mass of willing, obedient consumers and workers. Essentially, we're talking about people who want to Sovietize Europe, and the people opposed to that are in Moscow, and they should be in Washington. And that's what we thought President Trump was, opposed to those very same things. Yeah, this could not be more confusing.
Well, and I'm going to add to the confusion, or rather, I'm going to illustrate more of the confusion, because prior to this declaration on the 10th of May, you also had, and I think we talked about some of this last time you were on our show, but others have happened since, where you had a string of releases and announcements by the Trump administration. I almost said Biden administration. You could have forgiven me for that mistake, because we said, here's a $50 million package for military support. Here's a $350 million F-16 package. Here are more air defense missiles that you can have. And now, of course, we see that we're still helping with these, with the targeting issue for the weapons that only we can facilitate here. So all those things in the background, that may be the reason why these European leaders and Zelensky were so cocky when Zelensky added this.
І у нас в Україні немає жодної проблеми вести перемовини. Ми готові до будь-яких форматів. Я буду в цей четвер, 15 травня, в Туреччині. І очікую на Путіна в Туреччині. Особисто. І сподіваюся, що Путін цього разу не шукатиме причин, чому він щось не може. Ми готові говорити, щоб закінчити війну. Четвер. Туреччина.
You may not have been able to read those words on the bottom of the screen, but that was Zelensky saying, I'm going to meet you in Turkey on Thursday, and you better not hide from me this time. We're going to come in there, and we're better be ready to talk. So one that wonders, why would he be so cocky on that when Trump has been trying, at least publicly, to get him to agree to a ceasefire or to agree to an end of war negotiation?
President Trump, through his own actions, has made himself irrelevant to the outcome in Ukraine. All of this is mindless, empty bluster from Zelensky. Remember, Zelensky is the man that is selling off as much of Ukraine as he can to the highest bidder. And that means to BlackRock and Monsanto and any number of different major firms in the United States who want to get their hands on the agricultural potential of Western Ukraine. He is quite willing to sell anything to anybody right now in Ukraine in order to stay in power. And this is just empty bluster. Now, what will they actually discuss in Turkey? Who knows? But we know from experience that if you come back and you make it abundantly clear that the Russians are going to retain what they've taken on the ground, that you are going to have to recognize the legitimacy of what they've taken and opt absolutely for true neutrality on the Austrian model, as I've mentioned many, many times, I suspect these people will probably go home and be executed. So the question is, why should any of this be taken seriously by Moscow? I think Moscow wants to end the war. Moscow wants to also maintain its position of legitimacy with not only Europeans, but with the global South, with the rest of the world, because right now, Russia is seen as having been from the beginning on the right side. Ukraine is widely seen as the problem. The truth is Ukraine was just utilized by us. Ukrainians were exploited by us. Ukrainians had no say in the matter whatsoever. So this is all quite pointless in my judgment, but I'm sure that the Russians will sit down with them and we'll see what comes out of it. But as far as we are concerned, I think President Trump, his Secretary of State, are irrelevant now to the process.
Well, and just kind of to deepen that, unfortunately, a little bit more, after, at least allegedly, according to European leaders publicly, Trump saying, yes, I agree with you guys, let's go for this 30-day unconditional ceasefire demand on Putin on Monday. After Putin comes out and says, hey, how about we just talk about ending the war on Thursday? Trump then inexplicably and immediately jumps on it with the Truth Social, to where he says, and I'll read this for you, those who may not be able to read the words, President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the bloodbath. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. At least they will be able to determine whether or not a deal is possible. And if it is not, European leaders in the U.S. will know where everything stands and can proceed accordingly. I'm starting to doubt that Ukraine will make a deal with Putin, who's too busy celebrating victory of World War II. And then he goes on to say some other thing. Have the meeting now, he says. So almost completely flipped what apparently he told to the Europeans and the Ukrainians. What do you make of this contradiction?
You know, Dan, we have this saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And I think that sums up the Trump administration. It doesn't know where it's headed. It doesn't know what it wants. There is no coherent strategy. There never has been. There was no strategy under Biden other than let's harm Russia. Right now, we've half signed on for the Biden policy, but we're still holding out hope for something else. At the end of the day, this is the path to irrelevance. It's the path to nowhere. And that's the path that President Trump and his administration are on with Russia. You know, and then stop and consider, as we've talked before, when you sit down and you're talking with the Russians, you're also forging potentially the potential for understanding with other countries. Remember that Russia has an enormous standing in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and they can be extraordinarily helpful to us in dealing with China and other countries. We know that the Japanese have now effectively signed on with China to oppose us and our tariffs because we offended them pointlessly, made outrageous demands, and they said, fine, we'll do business with China. You can go and do whatever you like and we'll do business not in dollars, but in our own currency. And this ultimately is the theme right now since the tariffs. The de-dollarization is begun globally. So all of this is a disaster because no one from the very beginning had a clear strategy, a clear policy path. And I don't see how this administration recovers from this disaster.
Well, that's a pretty strong statement because I agree that I don't know that they, other than just ending the conflict, there doesn't seem to be a plan for how to do it because you go way wildly from one side to the other in a course of about 12 hours. Really strange there. But let's take a look at these different parties and see what their play actually is, whether they have a plan or whether they just are just motoring on forward wherever that leads with nobody at the wheel. Let's take a look at it. And Gary, a little bit out of order here. I'd like to jump to the Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron from this past weekend, where they're laying out a vision for what they want to see accomplished. And please bear in mind, as people are watching this, this is well into the fourth year of war.
It is for Russia, it's for Putin to come to the table for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, and there must be clear sanctions if he fails to do so. There is real unity on that. We need to be clear that that is one of the main outcomes we want from this meeting of the Coalition of the Willing here this morning.
All of us have now to back this unconditional ceasefire for 30 days and increase pressure on Russia. And it means unconditional ceasefire in sky, on land, at sea, that should be long enough and that could be renewable. And we have to increase the coordination with the US, taking as a basis what Lindsey Graham put on the table, but a strong coordination, and you are on the right side of history. Because you protect your sovereignty, your territory, and doing so, you are at the forefront as well of the protection of the whole European territory.
I just have a hard time understanding what the intent is because they know, every one of them, they're not stupid men. They can't be. They do have a brain. They know that Russia will never agree to any of that. They know they're not going to be compelled into a ceasefire. So then the question is, what is their actual plan to go forward? Why would they do this?
As I said before, these are globalists. Somebody the other day called them Sorosistas, because they're all backed by our friend George Soros and his crowd, who are effectively preaching a warmed-over version of Bolshevism. These people want to stay in power. They see the hostility with Russia, the permanent conflict with Russia, as helping to maintain their positions. They're wrong. They're not going to last because financially, they're all on the edge of total ruin. We are already headed into a severe recession. The severe recession, depending upon what we do in the near future, could become a depression. No one wants to do what needs to be done in order to build prosperity in the West. That is, cut spending, rein in the stupidity, end the pointless commitment to conflict and wars. Nobody wants to go there because if you do that, your whole raison d'etre is going to be questioned. So they have to keep things as they are, maintain the status quo, continue the hostility with Russia. What President Putin has to do, and I think he knows this, is frankly continue to be patient. He can be patient, and the longer he waits, the worse the conditions in Europe become for these leaders, the higher the probability that they will fall and be replaced by nationalists who are going to say, wait a minute, there's no interest in Germany in a war with Russia. Even the polls, if you look at the Polish polling data, have said we don't want any war with Russia. This is crazy. We don't know how many Polish soldiers have actually been killed in the war. I've heard estimates to be 10,000. Others have told me 20,000. But they've lost severely with absolutely no return on that investment whatsoever. I think they've exhausted in Poland this unrelenting hatred for all things Russian. I think the population has said it's over, and we've got all these Ukrainians that need to go home. We want to get them out of Poland. You have a similar growing feeling in Germany, and you have a problem in Great Britain right now. The population there is wondering why they have to give way to all of these foreigners that have come into their country, why their citizenship is meaningless, their identity is meaningless. I think the mayor of London has recently forbidden all of the taxi cabs to have a Union Jack, in other words, the British flag, shown on any of the taxis. I mean, this sort of active suppression of national identity is absolutely unacceptable across Europe. These people are on the wrong side of history. It's interesting to hear that discussion. And then let's face it, what do these people have for armed forces? They're Lilliputian forces.
Right.
It's a joke. The Russians would crush these people. Our own forces are too small for any serious war right now, despite the enormous amounts of money that we've plowed into them. So the whole thing is a comic opera. It doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. But I think the Russians will go to Istanbul, and they will listen, and they will present their side. But I just don't know how the representatives who come there from Ukraine can expect to accomplish anything if they think they're going to have a bullet through their head from the Ukrainian secret police, the SBU, when they come back to Kyiv and point out that, look, we need neutrality. The Russians guarantee it. We can get other Europeans to guarantee it. We're going to lose this territory in these areas, but we need peace. Ukraine is in ruins. If they say that, I think they'll simply be executed. That's how bad the situation is in Ukraine.
So then can you boil it down to as simple as the European leaders that were assembled there have made a calculated choice to keep the rhetoric going, to make it where Putin can't agree to anything that they want, knowing that he won't, so that the war will continue in Ukraine, but not go beyond that? I mean, can you cynically say that that's their intent?
Well, I think there's also behind the scenes enormous interest in Great Britain, probably France as well, in the Greater Israel Project as an opportunity to destroy Iran as a country and to gain control of Iran's natural resources. Remember, the original idea behind the stupidity in Ukraine was not just to utilize the Ukrainians to, quote unquote, harm Russia. They actually believed that they could destroy the regime. In other words, that the Putin government would fall, the Russian population would turn on its government, the society would fragment. This is part of the mirror imaging that we go through. We see the deteriorating cohesion in our societies in the West, thanks to mass uncontrolled immigration. And we assume that they too suffer from a similar lack of cohesion, but they don't. On the contrary, there's enormous cohesion in Russia that is, after all, 80% of the population consists of Orthodox Christian Russians. Makes a huge difference. But they've also done an excellent job of integrating the Muslim peoples that live inside their country. The largest group, of course, are the Chechens, but there are others. And so they have a social contract or compact with all the people there that is very strong. We've ignored that and believed that we could destroy it. Well, that has failed miserably. So now the effort is, how do we sustain ourselves? Let's go after Iran. Let's break it up. Use the Israeli Greater Israel Project as a pretext to introduce U.S. and allied military power into the equation to destroy Iran and get control of Iranian oil and natural gas resources, including the Persian Gulf. Then we can sustain ourselves in Europe without any dependence whatsoever ever again on Russian natural gas and oil. Well, this is
so. Let me ask you just real quick, because I want to stick with the European stuff here, but that you bring up a good point that needs to be addressed real quick, because you talk about this is what a lot of the so-called globalists, what they apparently want in the Middle East, and in terms of Trump on this one too, and we've shown this several times on the show. In early March, I mean, he made it sound like that the decision has already been made and there's about to be going to war and there will be bombing in Iran or whatever. And now all of a sudden he's kind of flipped way over on the other side. And he says, no, I really want a negotiated settlement there. So whereas now he's not talking to Netanyahu, where is Trump in all of this?
You know, it's sort of like the game we used to play called Where's Waldo? Everyone is trying to pin down where the president actually stands on any number of issues. I think it's unfortunate. President Trump instinctively opposes war. I mean, I know that. I know he does. And I think that for a very long time, he has tried to figure out how he can come to terms with the Iranians, because I think there's an appreciation for the dangers associated with blowing the Iranian war up. That's true. But the problem is that his intentions, however good they may be, don't mean anything. He doesn't take a concrete stand of any kind for any length of time. You can't do business like that. It's sort of like a teenager on TikTok that has the attention span of 30 seconds, a minute, and then goes to the next TikTok video. We've been treating policy that way. And people outside the country look at us and say, wait a minute, how long does policy last in your country? Well, historically, over the last 20 years or so, 20, 25 years, I think they've concluded it lasts for one election cycle. And then you get a new group of people to talk. I mean, Charles or Chaz Freeman said it best many years ago to me. He says we get a president in with a new administration and they proceed to lobotomize Washington. In other words, throw everything overboard and start over as though they have the answer. And the fresh set of eyes will prove brilliant. Well, this has been catastrophic for us because other nations look for long-term strategic organization and goals that lead, hopefully, to prosperity and peace. Well, we haven't even done that over the last 90 to 100 days under President Trump. He's all over the map. So asking me, where does President Trump fit? Well, if you have no coherent strategy, it's back to the original statement. If you don't know where you're going, then any particular road looks good at any given point in time.
And now you talk about what it looks like to others outside the country. We looked at the European side. We've looked at the Ukraine side. Now I want to take a look at what the Russians are saying. So yesterday on ABC News, Dmitry Peskov was asked what the Russian position is on this, and what does Putin mean when he says he wants an end to war negotiations?
President Putin is open for peace negotiations without any preconditions. And this is what he was proposing for the last couple of weeks. He keeps saying that we are ready for negotiations, for direct negotiations.
But direct negotiations is different than being very close to a deal, as President Trump said. Were you close to a deal?
Yes. Well, Ukraine settlement is a very complicated thing. It is not as simple as to sign one paper, A4 size, and proclaim it a deal. That's a settlement process full of tiny details. And each of that detail is vitally important for the future of both Russia and Ukraine.
So she was asking him a question because Trump had said a week or so ago that we're really close to a deal. The two sides are really close, and I want to have this. And you see Peskov being very diplomatic and not wanting to be rude, apparently. And he says, well, there's a lot more going into it. How do you just characterize generally the Russian view on all of this madness that you just got through describing?
Well, I think you got it right about politeness. I think they want to be polite because they do not want to exclude the possibility of some sanity entering into the discussion. President Trump likes to talk about deals. The problem is that in most cases, for instance, with these tariffs and talking to China recently in Switzerland, there was no great deal emerging from the discussions in Switzerland. There was a willingness to continue negotiations, to talk further. You're not going to get anywhere with China or most of the great powers in Asia for years. You've destroyed something, you've offended everybody, and now you say you want a deal. Well, you're not going to get, quote unquote, a deal like that. And what he's trying to say is that from the beginning, the Russians have talked about things like denazification. That has to happen. They're not kidding. They're talking about these people who have run around and committed terrible atrocities, particularly in Bucha, which we've talked about previously, and other places, murdering civilians, murdering soldiers. They murdered people in the Kursk Oblast. That's unacceptable. That particular element in the Ukrainian government has to go away. The problem for the Ukrainian people is how can they make an impact when they're faced or confronted with the secret police showing up at their door and killing them? So it's a very difficult problem. The second thing is they talked about neutrality. That's not up for discussion. There will be no membership in NATO, yet you continue to hear that nonsense from Zelensky and others in Europe that, well, they're a sovereign state. They have the right to do whatever they want. Well, in theory, we all have sovereignty and we can all do things, but none of us can do whatever we want. We cannot do whatever we want. We live with other people on the planet. The Ukrainians live next to Russia. The Ukrainians live next to Poland and Romania and the Baltic states. They can't do whatever they want. All of us are constrained in some fashion if we want to live in peace with our neighbors. Right. That's all nonsense. And I think the point is that in those oblasts in the east, where people have voted themselves into Russia, that stands. And as far as I can tell, those votes were by no means illegal. They were very fairly carried out, and people went out of their way in the middle of a war to go out and cast their votes, and they were not casting votes at gunpoint. So that's nonsense. The same thing was true in the Crimea. Those places are going to remain part of Russia. Now, if you're going to go in there and take the position that all of that's up for discussion, your negotiations aren't going to go anywhere. And we don't know, but I suspect that negotiations are going to break down over these conditions. And as the other point of this is, you cannot expect a ceasefire as long as you're convinced that the NATO states and the United States will continue to supply military equipment and support to Kyiv. So at the end of the day in Russia, they look at this and they see no real rays of hope whatsoever. If we stopped supplying the Ukrainians, which is something we should have done months ago, if we said we're stopping this, and if you don't negotiate, there will be no resumption under any circumstances of any aid. But for the moment, we're stopping it until you do a sit down and agree to talk to the Russians. If we did that, I think that might have an impact. But we're not willing to do that. We're not taking the whole matter seriously. And indeed, we fixed it so that we are not being taken seriously anymore.
Yeah, and that is one of the big underlying problems. Martha Raddatz also asked Dmitry Peskov the difference between being willing to have an unconditional 30-day ceasefire and negotiating an end-to-war deal to end the fighting. And he said this.
Ukraine is trying to escape from negotiations.
Ukraine says they're ready for a ceasefire right now, a 30-day ceasefire.
But they're not ready for immediate negotiations. Ceasefire was supported by President Putin, but he asked several questions. He said that right now we have a certain dynamics on the fronts. Russian troops are advancing, and advancing in quite a confident way. So if we speak about ceasefire, what are we going to do with shipments of weapons coming every day from the United States and from European countries?
So you want those weapons stopped?
Well, if we do a temporary ceasefire,
you want the weapons stopped.
Otherwise, it will be advantage for Ukraine.
Yeah, you saw her face like smile like, ha, you want to stop the weapons during a ceasefire. And he's like, why would it be any other way? I mean, that really just kind of speaks to what you said a second ago from the Russian side.
Well, Martha Raddatz is another neocon. Come on, let's be frank. She's not there with an objective purpose in mind. She's there to promote the conflict on behalf of Zelensky and his neocon supporters. It's a waste of time. He's being very polite, and my hat is off to him for having handled it as well as he did. But he's essentially correct. You started this entire discussion by talking about 524 drones and missiles, many of which were supplied by the United States as well as other countries, as well as the things that the Ukrainians were able to build themselves. All of them, thankfully, were shot down so that the 9 May celebrations were not interrupted. But the point is, under what circumstances should anyone in Moscow take us seriously? Right after that, it's absurd. It's nonsensical. And then we have the president of the United States who is signing on for this nonsense that the globalist leaders of Western Europe want to do in order to sustain and promote the conflict. He's got to get it through his head that they are not his friends. They are not his allies. They are globalists. That's where it is. Now, he can either do business with them or he can cut them off and say, we're out because we don't want a war with Russia. We're not supporting this anymore. He understands that, but he's failed to do it repeatedly.
Well, and here's part of the problem in terms of what the president does and doesn't get. And Gary, this is going to be another one a little bit out of order, but I want to jump down to Republican member of Congress McCall, who's going to talk about what he sees. This is also over the weekend, where he's going to talk about that. It sounds to me like he is actually in agreement with the European leaders. And again, he's from the president's own party, but notice how he talks about the centrality of a ceasefire first.
There was a 30-day ceasefire called for. Mr. Putin decided to bomb Ukraine on Palm Sunday. He's not making any concessions at all, while Zelensky seems to be making all the concessions. So if the bottom line is Putin has to agree to a 30-day ceasefire for any peace talks to go forward. And the land that he is asking for is, that even J.D. Vance talked about this, and the president, land that Russia has not even occupied in Ukraine. So he has to operate in good faith. We want peace, but not peace at any price.
Well, that's like, no, I don't care what the reality is. I don't want to do this, so we just won't. But I mean, where can this kind of thinking lead to on the actual battlefield?
Destruction, the complete annihilation of the Ukrainian military, and ultimately the extinction of the Ukrainian government. Look, McCall doesn't know what he's talking about. Look up the people that donate to McCall's campaigns, where his money comes from. That'll answer most of your questions about why he says what he does. The man knows nothing, absolutely nothing about Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, or anything else. That's true for most people on the Hill. So he's a perfect example of ignorance and arrogance. He's reading talking points that are handed to him by people that are telling him, this is what we want you to say because we're donating to your campaign. You have in both parties some independent elements. You have an example with Bernie Sanders. You have an example on the other side with Rand Paul. But overwhelmingly, these people are members of the Uniparty. There's no longer any clear distinction between Republicans and Democrats as we once imagined them. These people are all being paid by more or less the same groups of people to say and do what they want. And that's what they're going to do. And the people that are making these decisions on the Hill, they know nothing about these things. They don't understand the history, the culture, the geography, the interests, and they don't care. It's not important to them. I mean, just imagine this fanciful answer, we're not going to sign on for peace at any price. Well, suit up, my friend, get a rifle. We'll drop you off on the front lines there in Ukraine, and you can, put your views to the test. You can demonstrate your great spine and character and commitment. It's not going to happen. These people don't have any. They're doing what they're doing for reasons that make absolutely no sense. But it does make a lot of sense if you're sitting in their chair and you're watching your campaign re-election funds fill up with millions of dollars from the people that want you to do these things. So, listening to these people on the Hill these days is deeply depressing. There is no light, it would appear, at the end of the tunnel.
So in the last few minutes we have here, I wonder if you can kind of give me your best military assessment from what's going to happen on the ground, especially from the Ukraine side. So we see the globalists that you talked about there, the European leaders. We see Zelensky. We even see some American politicians, and Trump seems to be kind of all over the map. But when you get down to it, the arena itself on the ground, the Ukrainian soldiers who have been suffering egregious, almost certainly well over 1 million deaths. I don't even know how many total casualties, and they're just continuing to throw them into the meat grinder. How much longer do you think that they can continue fighting in a coherent way that is still quite put up a robust defense that has slowed or that keeps the Russian offensives as a slow? But how much longer will they keep going down this path to where they just throw their lives away for something they see can't work on the battlefield?
Well, first of all, I don't think they've succeeded in slowing the Russians. I think the Russians have moved very deliberately with the goal of avoiding unnecessary casualties on their side. As I've said many times to people, President Putin is the first Russian leader in a very long time that was concerned about losses. You go back and read Zhukov's memoirs, the memoirs of some of the other generals that served under him. The point they make over and over and over again is that no one could dare mention losses to Stalin. If you mention losses to Stalin, you risk being eliminated, being fired. Stalin didn't care. That's why the true figures are not 27 million. They're closer to 39 and 40 million in terms of dead. That's the tragedy of the Second World War. But I think Putin has made it very clear he's not prepared to take those. Now, he enjoys overwhelming superiority in firepower, mobility in every case. The ground is hardened now. It's no longer as swampy and messy as it was all the way through March and April. He can launch a major offensive if he wants to. He can strike a hammer blow whenever he chooses to do so. There are still little holdouts of people in the vast forests and woods that they're essentially ankle biters in a strategic sense, but they too are slowly but surely being eliminated. But he can strike, and he can strike decisively if he chooses to do so. I think he would rather see a negotiated end to the conflict. So he's going to give this another try. Will this amount to anything, or will it end up as you and I have just discussed? I don't know. But I think his view is, let's give this one more shot, and then I'm done with this. And I think you will see they will roll up the territory to the Dnieper, and at some point a decision will be made to probably cross further north on the Dnieper, and then move south to secure Odessa. And the reason for that is that Odessa is the principal entry point for much of the arms and equipment that are being shipped into Ukraine. And then he will also move on Kyiv. He has to, and extinguish this regime. Those are the things that are on the table right now. They have the capability, they can do it. Whatever these nonsensical armchair generals in the United States tell you, they can do it. But he hasn't wanted to. He still doesn't want to. But he will act if there is no alternative.
And kind of got one last follow-up question there. Let's say that whether sooner or later, that is the end that comes. And let's say that Russia moves right up to the gates of Kyiv. They take Odessa. They take everything to the Dnieper River and some beneath it to the south. And then they're ready to close down on what's going to be a military victory. What does the landscape look like, especially for these globalists who have been preaching success this whole time, and then they're faced with the physical defeat on the battlefield at the side that they supported? What becomes of those leaders?
Well, in 1968, I was a young man. I was only 15, but I happened to be in what was then Czechoslovakia and subsequently down in Yugoslavia, or what used to be Yugoslavia, in Zagreb and Ljubljana. And we had the Prague Spring at the time, so it was fascinating to be there. I didn't understand it all, but it was an interesting introduction to things. Back in the United States, LBJ, as president, knew that the Soviets were going to move against the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. And he made some comments about it, but then to signal that we would absolutely not disrupt or intervene in any way with it, he went on vacation and left Washington. That's what he did, because he knew we were tied up in Vietnam. There was not much we could do militarily if the Soviets really wanted to go into Czechoslovakia, which of course they did. I think that in the United States, once it becomes clear what the Russians are going to do, Donald Trump is going to lose face. His administration will be shown for what it is: incoherent, unfocused, and failing. Who knows what the consequences politically for him will be, because everyone in Congress will attack him, and I'm sure he'll be told that he's responsible for losing Ukraine, which is nonsense. Ukraine was never his to begin with. He didn't want it. But instead of being smart and bailing out of this nonsense early on, he listened to all the wrong people and is stuck like a bug on flypaper. But he'll be held responsible. In Europe itself, all of the leadership in Europe will be identified as buffoons, because there's not a damn thing they can do. And if they try to do something, I think in most cases, the military leaders, certainly on the continent, will meet with them and say, we can't intervene. We have no capability to do so will be crushed. The one exception, of course, is Starmer sitting out there on that island. He may think he can do something, but he's probably in even worse shape. Right now, the Polish army is much larger, more capable than the British army or the French army. And they're not going to take this on. They know what's out there. They're not ready for it. So I think this will hasten the end of the globalist regimes, which is a good thing for Europe. They need to go away. All of these globalists need to be canned once and for all. Then Europe needs to be rescued from destruction by this mass migration of people into it who are not Europeans, never will be, and feel nothing but contempt for European civilization and the Christian foundations that support it.
Well, that's a pretty dire picture in there, and of course, one that is not inevitable. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's hard for me to argue, Doug, that the trends are going that way. That these guys who are right now in charge of pulling levers, I don't know if they somehow want that to happen or if they're just oblivious to it, and that they arrogantly think, no, we'll be able to maneuver things to keep it so it keeps going. I don't know, but I think that they're going to be badly, badly disappointed in the future.
Yeah, I think that's right.
We'll have to wait and see how it's going to do, but what's going to turn out. But as always, we really appreciate you coming on today. And by the way, Gary's showing there again, this new show, Macgregor, which looks really cool. I wish we could show the audio because it's really cool when it does. Gary, if you could put that in the description so people can follow that. But how's the show going, Doug? And when's the next episode?
Well, the next episode is called On War, and it's really an examination of the fact that we've never followed the Constitution, or certainly haven't since 1942. We haven't declared war on anybody, but we've committed ourselves to conflicts all over the world. And we look at it from a legal standpoint and also from a moral standpoint and from the standpoint of realistically, what is our chance of prevailing in future wars, particularly if we decide to take action against Iran. And again, as you were talking about earlier, that picture is just as confusing and foggy and obscure as it is in Europe. I mean, we're not sure which way this administration is going or wants to go.
Wow, I'm really eager for that. And when is that program air?
It should be out at the end of next week. So that means just a little bit beyond the 15th, it should be ready. We've got one more interview to do within the next couple of days, and otherwise we'll be able to launch. And I think people will find it very interesting because it's an interesting diversity of people with different backgrounds, different perspectives.